Were there two Britons in the 1930s? A key question that has been asked by historians ever since. Was Britain consumed by a depression in the 1930s nationwide, from north to south, from east to west? This term two nations, was first used in the 19th century, in the 1800s, to define the division of Britain between rich and poor. And there was a criticism at that time that there was a southern-dominated parliament that didn't understand the problems of people who lived in the northern part of the United Kingdom. Posh, elitist politicians who don't have a clue what's happening in places like Liverpool and Manchester and Sheffield and so on. And in the 1930s, there was a feeling, at least, that there were divides across the country between the northwest and the southeast, between different regions within counties or within areas, between Wales and the rest of the UK, between Scotland and the rest of the UK. There was this line of thought that there was a purposeful economic division going on. The government actually recognised the fact there were certain areas that were very, very badly hit by the depression of the 1930s. They called these areas special areas. And through the Special Areas Act of 1934, they actually initiated a programme of redevelopment, of business development in these key areas. And you can see those key areas on the map. So, for example, you have South Wales, you have Clydeside in Scotland. These areas were destitute compared to, say, areas around London, around the suburbs of London that were not. Of course, those areas, those special areas, it's no coincidence that prevalent in those areas were industries like steel, mining and textiles that had been in decline even before the depression of the 1930s. They'd been in decline in the 1920s due to competition from countries like USA and Japan. So they were double hit, if you like, by the recession that came about because of the Wall Street crash in the United States. And it led to unemployment rates that were huge. And to give you an example, in Blackburn, a northern town, 100 out of 130 mills were closed in Blackburn by the end of 1932. So that's a huge amount of mills. That's a huge amount of people who've lost their jobs. But in the south, near London, you had companies like Hoover, making, obviously, Hoovers, and Gillette, making shaving equipment and all alike. They were setting up assembly lines, making working conditions better for people down south. They got good wages, cleanliness, health and safety was better in these new factories compared to, say, the mines or the mills or whatever up north. So in the south, workers, in some cases, were getting a better deal. Cars were being produced en masse from 1937 onwards, again, mainly in the south. There was some car production in the north, but mainly in the south. New consumer goods were being produced in the south. Radios, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, gramophones, toasters, kettles, carpets, furniture, lots of other items that were driving the economy around London. There was a massive house building drive in the south, around suburbs, towns and cities. 2.7 million new homes were built throughout the 1930s. Most of those were in the south. There were some in the north, like the Council House programme was in the north, but most of these new homes were being built privately in the south. Popular entertainment, access to this increased massively in the 1930s, and between 1924 and 35, cinema audiences went up from 36,000 a year to 8 million a year. Radios, tabloids, professional sport, they all became very popular in the 1930s. And that was across the whole country. These things became affordable to more and more people. And that surely shows that actually if cinema audiences are rising nationwide, then does that mean that there's not a divide? Does that mean that people everywhere have extra money in their pockets in the 1930s? But of course, there were still 1.5, 2 million people who were unemployed in this period. an interesting point would be to say, for those in work, times were pretty good in the 1930s. And we can actually have a look, for example, at the divide between certain areas where unemployment was high. You can see here that in Wales, for example, which is here, 28.5% of people were unemployed in 1936. But if you look in the southeast of England, that figure is only 5.6% of working people were unemployed in 1936. That's a huge difference. That's 23% difference between these two regions. And you can see as well, Northern Ireland, Scotland and the north of England faring much worse than the south and London. So this is where this idea of two nations in the 1930s comes from. And you can also see here as well what we were saying about people in work. People in work and people out of work. People out of work were getting low amounts of money on the dole. They were barely able to feed themselves in a lot of cases, especially large families in northern cities. But those people in work, things weren't actually that bad. We were talking about the cinema tickets earlier. Well, if you look at this, this is the average retail prices across the country against the average wages. And you can actually see that wages are going up higher than the average prices around the country. So people have more money to spend in the 1930s. Obviously, we're talking about the 40s here, that it's going up. I mean, that's up to 1948. But certainly in the 30s, we're still seeing a gradual increase here in wages. And the wages are higher than the retail prices all the way across this period. It wasn't all bad. If you compare it to, say, the First World War, you can see that the prices and the wages are very, very close together, whereas the 20s and 30s, they're spaced out. And then after the war, it's improving even further. Again, just to demonstrate, nationally, unemployment is very high in the 30s, and it only comes down at the end, really, due to rearmament and due to the effects of building weapons to combat Hitler and Nazism. Again, is there a difference between people in certain trades in Britain? We talk about regional differences, but what about trades? You look at this, unemployment rate in, say, engineering was 8.3%. In shipbuilding, it was 30%. In commerce and finance, it was only 3.8%. So again, it's these old industries, the shipbuilding, the coal mining, the textiles. These are the industries where you're seeing mass unemployment, and of course they are located in the north and in Wales in a lot of cases, and that's why we get this idea of the two Britons. And of course we talk about housing, and we said that new homes were built like this one. I mean, this would have been your typical example of a home in the suburbs down south. Looks similar to probably what we'd see now, but obviously on the flip side of that is people on the other side were living in squalor, and we can see that here. We've got a bunch of terraced houses, industrial area, crowded, 2 up, 2 down, back-to-back housing. It's cramped, there's no toilet, there's only a toilet on the street. Now, these are almost industrial revolution, pre-1900 conditions that still exist in some areas in the 1930s. So I'll let you decide, were there two Britons? I would have to say that based on the evidence we've looked at in this tutorial, in my view, yes there was. I think there was. I think people in London and the South did have a better existence in the 1930s, but perhaps you would argue differently to that.